Welcome to How to Live Slow, the podcast where we discuss slow living for the modern woman and help you design an intentionally slower family life. I'm Rachelle Glendon, your personal slow living coach and host of this podcast. I know all about busy, but I love living slow. Enjoy the show. Well, hello and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I hope you're really well and thanks for joining me. Today, I want to talk about or expand on an idea that I shared. I had this shower thought that I shared on Instagram and Facebook, and it's the idea that overwhelm can be a guide if you listen. And I want to expand on that today because it was quite popular and people wanted to know, okay, overwhelm can be a guide. Well, how do I listen? So in my post, I wrote, overwhelm is not part of you. It's something you experience in response to your environment or your unconscious decisions or where you are in your cycle. And yeah, overwhelm can be a guide if you listen. So that's where I want to expand on today. Now, if you are keen to, use this information, if you check the show notes, I will have all of the information. I'll have a little bit of a script or what I wrote as my guide for this episode. I'll put that in the show notes, and there'll be those series of questions that we sort of ask so you can work through your overwhelm and get to know it a little bit better. So to use overwhelm as a guide, first of all, we need to think about what overwhelm isn't. So in my mind, it's not a mood and it's not a personality trait. So overwhelm is not who you are. What I found as I work with clients and in my own life as well is that people talk about overwhelm as if it's something that's from within them, and people identify or they self-describe themselves as being an easily overwhelmed person, like just as an example. But yeah, and I think that this is a real mind trick, right? If you think about that, it's like then there's a whole lot of other stuff that comes up behind that overwhelm. If it's part of you, then that means you're somehow faulty. But I think that that's not the right way to think about it, because to me, well, let's answer the question, what is overwhelm really? It's a feeling. It's a physical and emotional response to what you're currently experiencing in your external circumstances. So it's not actually part of you. It's your reaction to what's going on around you. So that's how you can think about overwhelm as being a guide. Like when you look at your life or the situation you're in, you can just ask yourself some questions like, what is causing me to feel overwhelmed? How am I committing? Like, have I overcommitted? Am I committed to too much? Have I got too much going on? Am I in a situation where my boundaries aren't being respected, or I feel like I can't say no? Am I in a situation where there's too much stimulation? Maybe it's too noisy, maybe it's overcrowded, maybe I'm thinking about something else, or, a situation has happened and now when something bad happens and like maybe you receive some bad news and then you have to just get on with your daily life. So you get up to, say, for example, the school gate, or you go to the shops and you're like, why? You feel like you're in a bit of a time warp, like something bad has happened in your life and everything else seems to be going on around you as if the bad thing hasn't happened, and it can feel really discombobulating. So that's another way that you can get kind of overstimulated, I guess. And like, what do I need right now to help me? What are my needs here? Like, what unmet need have I got that's causing me to feel overwhelmed? And then also like looking at like, what is the response in me really about? Like, am I overwhelmed because of the actual situation, or am I overwhelmed because this is a situation that mirrors another time when I was overwhelmed, or where I was out of control, or where I was helpless, or where my boundaries were overstepped? And I feel, sometimes you can notice the way that you've changed and evolved, or the work that you've done, because you get into a situation that mirrors something that's happened before, and you can feel that sense of like, my boundaries are being overstepped, someone's taking advantage of me, this situation has happened before, and you sort of fall back into that old pattern of dealing with it. And if you are taking the time to respond rather than react, you can actually, respond in a different way to get a different outcome. But, that's what you've got to be self-aware and ask, like, what is this response really about? And what can I do now? That's another thing to think about. Like, what can I do now? Like, how can I sort the situation out? How can I deal with the overwhelm? What do I need to do? So if you think of it that way, you can start to see that overwhelm is not you. It's not part of you. It's just information, and you can be guided by that information. I think that's the thing about so many different negative emotions, is that we feel like we have to get quickly away from them. So we have to deny them or pretend they don't exist and kind of sugarcoat over them so that we can get on with, being back to normal. And when we do that, then we're not really dealing with the cause and the underlying thing. Whereas like the better way of doing it is to deal with those situations or those circumstances and, fix them, tackle them head on, and not to make it feel like it's something that you've done wrong. So in that sense, then feeling overwhelmed is just a signpost. Sometimes it's a warning, but it can also be a good thing. And I mean that it can be a good thing because the overwhelm you experience, like in a situation where like maybe you've taken on too much or aren't taking good care of your nervous system, is a different kind of feeling of overwhelm to the overwhelm you experience when you're expanding your comfort zone. So meaning like when you take on an exciting project, you might be able to learn to expect overwhelm at different stages. Like it's part of growth. So when it, like for example, starting a podcast, right? Let's talk about that because that's something that I've done. I started my podcast and I was so overwhelmed, but I was excited by that. And, each step of the way, like I started off doing solo episodes and I got comfortable talking in a microphone. And then the next thing I wanted to do was interview some people, and I had some guests. And that was overwhelming because like the tech didn't work, or did I record on Zoom? Were they using the right, headphones or whatever? Like maybe the recording stuffed up or whatever. And that can be really overwhelming. Then I've got to have a conversation and say like, can we record again or whatever? But that's a comfort zone expanding. Then after those conversations, I was then able to, take on maybe some clients, working one-on-one with them. And I felt a bit more comfortable talking to people who I'd never met before on Zoom to do some coaching with them, for example. And so those overwhelming moments can be a sign that your comfort zone is expanding and that you're experiencing personal growth. Very subtle difference to the feeling of overwhelm that you get in a situation where, you've taken on too much or you're not taking good care of yourself. But it does take a lot of self-knowledge to know the difference, because obviously if you're starting a podcast and you're getting overwhelmed, the difference between that feeling versus the feeling of overwhelm from overcommitting, it could feel the same. Like you could almost go like, well, if you need to be able to be aware enough to go, okay, well, that's actually me being overwhelmed because my comfort zone is expanding. I'm going on a personal growth thing, and to move towards that overwhelm. Whereas the other overwhelm of being overcommitted, they could be the same, whereas the overwhelm of being overcommitted would require you to look at changing some stuff and take some stuff away from your life so that you can sit in that comfort zone and then expand it in a different way. Very subtle differences. But what happens is it takes creating a slower life to get that clarity, and so then when that overwhelm shows up, and you can learn to expect that that's going to happen. And you can kind of say like, oh, hi, I've been waiting for you, but I'm doing it anyway, So yeah, I think that that's a really key distinction and good information to know. So also related to that is like learning to soothe yourself with good rest practices, completing your stress cycles and having some tools around that. And actually, using my methodology of taking a seasonal approach to your work and life, where you can kind of work with your overwhelm, because growth is non-linear. So, it's a cycle. So sometimes it's going up, sometimes you've got to retreat, whatever. So like, why not plan for life to be that way? Like, why not plan to live cyclically rather than trying to consistently be, linear in a non-linear world where that's just not going to work anyway? Yeah. So learning to work with your good overwhelm like that will not only expand your comfort zone and your capacity, it will help you to know and sense when your body is experiencing the other kind of overwhelm that signals that you might have taken a wrong turn, like you might have overcommitted or whatever. So yeah, again, it works both ways. Like we can sense overwhelm that's good and sense overwhelm that might mean, you need to make a change. But by denying your overwhelm completely, like shaming yourself for feeling guilty for feeling it, you internalize it and literally turn off that guiding light, that information that you can take as a guide. You actually turn off your ability to notice that and to take action because you're denying that overwhelm. Because I think our cultural system of patriarchal capitalism wants that to be our situation, wants that to be our experience, because the system that we live in and that culture that we live in actually benefits from us internalizing our overwhelm. It's what drives the system, right? Same goes for any negative emotion or feeling that we have. Like if we're feeling overwhelmed in capitalist patriarchy, well, that's a good thing because it means that we are going to work harder. It means we're going to spend more money on solutions. We're going to be a good participant in that. And we're going to be a cog in the wheel rather than utilizing these tools and this self-knowledge to be a user of the system rather than, a cog in the turning of the system. Yeah. So I think it's important to recognize, feel all of your feelings, the good and the perceived bad, and listen and ask yourself, what is this telling me? That's the way to turn on your guiding light and let your response to overwhelm lead you down a new path. So an interesting way that this has shown up in terms of cyclical living for me is there's this school called the Red School, which has they teach cyclical living. They have a menstruality leadership program, and it's all about like learning to live in cycles and tuning into your own menstrual cycle to live more cyclically and kind of reject this idea that growth and life is linear. Because, that as they claim, like, and as they explain in their books and in their programs, like, humans are the only thing in the world that try to force ourselves into this linear progress where, all of nature is cyclical, and we are part of nature. And I really love this idea. And in their book, Wild Power, it's called, and they actually explain that like overwhelm and self-doubt and the inner critic all have important roles to play in our life, and they can be tracked around our cycle to keep us in check and to keep us on task and on track. But again, because we learn to ignore them, we're not as in tune with our bodies. And that is another area that you could maybe explore this idea, like maybe looking at your overwhelm and seeing, is this a cyclical thing? Does this show up at a particular time? Like for me, for example, when I'm coming from inner winter, which is menstruation, into inner spring, which is that pre-ovulatory phase, also called the follicular phase, that is a time when a lot of us have this surge of energy and we want to get started on new things. But what I've learned is that if I take on too much in those early stages, in those early days, I can get myself really overwhelmed because I overcommit immediately and then I can't keep myself on track. Where I know that now, so in my inner spring, I take it a little bit slower. I ease into it and I don't commit to too many projects, and I take my time to plan out my month ahead. And it eases my overwhelm and I experience a lot less overwhelm. And then when I get to my inner summer, that has played out well because it means that when in my inner summer, I tend to be a bit more distracted. I find admin tasks, for example, a little bit hard to concentrate on. And then that can that's been eased because I've got a little bit less, I've got a bit more time freedom around how I spend my inner summer, which is all about being outwardly. Like currently I'm recording this is an inner summer. So you can kind of tell the difference with the way that I speak and the way that I present and how engaging I am, I guess. Well, maybe you can't, but I can definitely tell. And actually, funnily enough, it actually shows up in my podcast numbers, like the listens that I get and the shares that I get and the comments and the feedback that I hear from you guys. It's very interesting to me to see the difference between those numbers and those reactions and those responses and the emails that I get from you versus the ones where I've recorded on a different part of my cycle, or I don't get as much feedback, or maybe I don't feel as good about that particular episode, so I don't promote it as much or I don't share it out. And I just see that that's very interesting. So my new strategy is to record my podcasts during my inner summer. So there's that, right? But then we can get, and just to expand on this idea, as you go from inner summer to inner autumn, which would be, inner autumn is your luteal phase, which would be the phase where you probably associate with like premenstrual, like you're cranky or whatever. This is where the inner critic comes. And like as the ladies at Red School explain, you head from inner summer into inner autumn. And that is a changing of that outward growth to that slowing down to prepare for that inner winter. And so the inner critic is meant to show up during your inner autumn. Chats to you and tells you, like maybe this wasn't, handled the right way, or, maybe you could do this in a different way. And you start to, and it kind of like they call it the bursting of the bubble, which I really like this idea because otherwise we're constantly in this linear growth progression. Like imagine if we were always in inner summer, always in that high energy, high productivity, high growth phase, it just wouldn't work. So we need our inner critic to show up and be like, okay, let's review things. How did that go? So the inner critic and overwhelm can be actually really linked, and self-doubt as well. So they can be tracked around the cycle. And I'm really interested to see how you experience this and whether you can start to see any patterns and whether your overwhelm shows up at different phases of your cycle, and how you've learned to listen to your overwhelm and how you've learned to listen to your inner critic and take that voice of the inner critic, to not mean something bad about you, but to just use it as like almost a life review system. And that's where I say it's really important that we take some time to like allow ourselves to feel our, air quotes, negative emotions and feelings, and to listen to what is our overwhelm saying? What is the self-doubt saying? What is that inner critic saying? doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't mean that we're a bad person or that we've stuffed up or that, we're a failure. That voice isn't real, but it can give us really good information that can improve our lives. So, there's so much talk about how, you've got to have positive thinking, you've got to have an abundance mindset and all of, positive. And that is true. But if you're only focused on that, then there can be a real sense of an underlying sense that life is not as fulfilling. Focusing on happiness and joy all the time without understanding that there has to be that balance, that just perpetuates the problem. And we never really, get that sense of deep inner fulfillment because we're not really, listening to our overwhelm. So if that's your experience, I would really love to know how this episode might help you to see that all of your feelings are important and that you can use overwhelm as a guide. So that's the main part of the episode for today. If you really enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more of this kind of stuff, I really would love for you to come over to my website. It's howtoliveslow.com and sign up for email updates. I send out a weekly email with even more of this kind of stuff, with lots of tools and tips and inspiration for slowing down, living more seasonally, deconditioning from the patriarchal capitalist culture that we live in and finding that inner fulfillment, right? And also, as a side note, 2 bits of news. Because my family and I are going on an overseas trip for 4 months in the middle of September through to the middle of January, the podcast will be going on a pause mode. So I may have maybe 1 episode a month, maybe less than that over those 4 months, which is very exciting. It's time for me to step back and have a bit of a break. And also, though, I am offering again my very popular 1 hour for $60 one-on-one session, slow coaching session. I offered this back in May and it was really popular. And so I've decided that to celebrate the fact that I'm going away and that things will be really slowing down in terms of the content that I'm creating, I'd love to offer you another final opportunity to grab one of those one-on-one sessions with me throughout the month of August and the first week of September. This offer is available. So you can grab up to 5 one-hour sessions with me for just $60 per session. And the results that I've had with my clients who just come and chat with me for 1 hour is actually really incredible. The small little things that you wouldn't think would make a big difference in your own life around slowing down and finding a bit more time and a bit more confidence to enjoy your life in the way that serves and fits you best. Just come on over and have a chat with me. I'd really love that. And so my website is howtoliveslow.com. You can find that there. And also, obviously, all the links for everything are in the show notes. And speaking of show notes, make sure you do check out the show notes because if you loved the episode, there's those questions that I mentioned in there so that you can think about how overwhelm might be a guide for you in your life. All right, that's it for me from now. And I will speak really soon. Take care. Bye. That's it for another episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you'd like to connect further, the show notes from today's episode, including all the social links and free resources, are over on my website, howtoliveslow.com/podcast. Have a beautiful week ahead, and I'll speak with you again soon.